Chapter 1. The Punctual Man. There are villages in England that seem to have been built not by architects, but by long tradition, where the church, the village, and the cottages blend harmoniously into their surroundings, like old furniture settling into the grooves of a carpet, and where nothing, not even sorrow, can arise without appropriate silence. Ashcombe-under-Lyne was such a village. It lay about 6 kilometres from St. Mary Mead, nestled in a fold of the downs where the mist would gather late in the morning and linger, as if hesitant to reveal too much of the place at once. Miss Jane Marple arrived by stagecoach on the afternoon of the first wet week of October, carrying a small suitcase, a quantity of knitting wool exceeding what the suitcase strictly contained, and the serene and quiet curiosity of a woman who, long ago, had ceased to be surprised by the actions of human beings, and who had now taken an interest in why she was to spend 2 weeks with her old school friend, Mrs. Hartnell, a well-to-do widow with inexhaustible opinions, who greeted her at the door with the particular brilliance of a woman who has known loneliness and refuses to admit it. "You'll find us very quiet here," said Mrs. Hartnell, leading her along the garden path between the faded Michaelmas daisies, their last colours of the season fading and turning brown at the edges. Nothing happens at Ashcombe. Nothing has happened at Ashcombe since the coronation, and even then there were only garlands. Miss Marple murmured something pleasant and thought to herself in secret, as she so often did, that the villages that prided themselves on their tranquillity were, without exception, those where she had seen the most extraordinary things. The following days had the gentle, regular rhythm to which she had almost grown accustomed. There was talk of a garden party. There was a new vicar whose sermons, in the general opinion of the village, lasted 4 minutes too long. There was the reassuring little choreography of daily life, the milkman at 7:30, the baker's boy at 9, and, like an unchanging clock, the postman, filtering through it all. From her very first day, she learned that his name was Walter Pruitt, and everyone spoke of him with that special affection reserved for those who ask for nothing and give much. He had been making the same rounds for 11 years. He knew which houses accepted the newspaper and which took only bills. He knew that the Hendersons' dog wouldn't bite if you let it sniff the bag first, and that old Miss Aldous liked to have her mail read aloud to her at the gate, because her eyesight was failing and she was too proud to admit it. He had lost his wife a few years before, quietly, without making a fuss, as he always seemed to do, and had carried on delivering the mail the following Monday, because, as he had told the vicar, letters must keep arriving, even if a man is sad. It was this remark, repeated in turn over tea on the third afternoon, that caught Miss Marple's attention and held her, not because it was strange, but because it was so profoundly, so touchingly, so ordinary. She thought, there is a whole philosophy of duty in this sentence, and a whole lot of pain on top of that. Then she thought no more of it, for there was seed cake to discuss, the inappropriate engagement of Mrs. Hartnell's nephew, and the darkening afternoon pressing her grey face against the window. It was a Thursday. She would later remember that it was a Thursday, the sky low and heavy, one of those mild, windless days when sound seems to travel farther than it should. When the news arrived through the alley, as it always does in these places, not shouted, but carried, passed from door to door in hushed voices, growing louder and louder, until it reached Mrs. Hartnell's door, already dressed in the air of tragedy. Walter Pruitt was dead. He had been found that morning in the walled garden of Larkspur Cottage, his mailbag still slung over his shoulder, as if he had simply lain down to rest and forgotten to get up. There was no doubt, reported Mrs. Hartnell, her hand to her throat, her usual brightness completely gone. He was dead, struck. Miss Marple placed her teacup with extreme care, as one places a fragile object in the presence of something larger and less fragile that has just broken. "And they say," continued Mrs. Hartnell, lowering her voice even further, as if the walls themselves could carry her to the cemetery, "that he was seen delivering the mail to Larkspur Cottage. Twice that morning, less than an hour later, young Tommy Aldous saw him walk up the path a second time, less than 20 minutes after the first. And the second time, she paused, and something in that pause suddenly made the dim autumnal light in the room feel colder. He never came out again." Miss Marple sat motionless, her needles resting quietly on her knees, and watched the garden darken, where the last daisies had begun, one by one, to close. A man who had done the same route, at the same pace, for 11 years, was not simply going, for no reason at all, to walk the same garden path twice in a single hour. She thought that something had driven Walter Pruitt to break the only rule he had ever followed, and she discovered, with that little intimate thrill that she would never have admitted to anyone, that she really wanted to know what it was all about. Chapter 2. A Broken Routine. On Friday morning, the village, like all villages, had organized itself so as to be able to accommodate its mourning without disrupting its routines. The post office blinds were half drawn, out of respect, although the counter still opened at 9 o'clock. The butcher spoke in hushed tones to his customers, and then, as soon as the bell above his door had stopped ringing, he resumed his usual conversation with his boy about the weather. In Ashcombe-under-Lyne, Miss Marple observed, mourning was concealed rather than expressed aloud. It blended discreetly into daily life, like a mourning band tucked into a coat sleeve until the appropriate moment. She had risen early, even before Mrs. Hartnell was fully awake, and had ventured, as she described with perfect sincerity, on a little detour through the garden, a detour that continued by a series of perfectly natural steps along the path and beyond the low stone wall that marked the boundary of Larkspur Cottage. She did not stop. She did not even slow her pace. But she saw, in the manner of a woman who has spent her life seeing everything and seeing nothing, that a policeman was standing at the garden gate, looking bored and numb with cold, and that the walled garden beyond him had the flattened and trampled appearance of a place trodden by too many careless feet in search of too little. She also noticed that the rose bushes along the south wall, old plants with heavy, withered heads, had been disturbed near their base, as if something or someone had brushed against them, and that a fresh flower had been torn from its stem and left on the gravel, already beginning to turn brown at the edges. It was surely nothing, she repeated firmly to herself as she continued on her way. The policeman's boots disturbed the gardens as easily as any more sinister threat, yet she found herself noting the precise spot under the third rosebush from the gate, very close to where the wall met the old yew hedge, with the same discreet and methodical attention she might have given to a dropped stitch 3 rows earlier in her knitting, not urgent, but not to be forgotten either. Inspector Colin Faraday was, Miss Marple decided from the first minutes of their meeting, a young man sincere in his ambitions, but utterly incapable of understanding that in Ashcombe the truth lay hidden, not in facts, but in silence. Summoned from the county town, he appeared at Mrs. Hartnell's that afternoon, ostensibly to ask if she or her guest had noticed anything unusual that morning, but in reality, Miss Marple suspected, because he had heard that a certain Miss Marple was staying in the village and had been warned, in the peculiar tone reserved for such a warning, that it was worth speaking to her. He was serious, blonde, inclined to state his theories rather than ask questions, and entirely convinced, one could see this conviction settling within him as he spoke, that Walter Pruitt had disturbed a thief. "A tramp, most likely," he said, accepting a cup of tea he didn't seem to want and swirling it in its saucer without touching it. "Or a traveller passing through. Pruitt caught him in the act. He broke into the house while the Applewhite ladies were out, we think, because they were both in Medchester that morning, and there was a fight. It's a sad story, but simple. I wouldn't be surprised. These things usually are." "How convenient that would be," said Miss Marple, in the gentle, pleasant tone she reserved for observations in which she did not believe a thing. The inspector, quite rightly, interpreted this as an agreement, and continued his explanation, with the confident pride of a young man presenting a case to an audience he assumes to be impressed, that nothing appeared to have been stolen from the cottage itself, which rather supported the theory that the thief had been disturbed before he could complete his work, although he could not, when Miss Marple asked him, say exactly what the thief had originally hoped to find in a modest cottage belonging to two ladies of good family without any particular fortune. "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "he was looking for something specific. People are so often specific, you know, when they go to such lengths to look. It's only in newspapers that thieves take whatever they can get their hands on. In my experience, real people, even real thieves, are terribly specific." The inspector laughed, without malice, and said that Miss Marple had evidently read a lot of detective novels. Miss Marple, with her hands clasped in her knees, admitted that she had read one or two and added nothing more on the subject, although something in her expression, had he been a more observant young man, might have made him hesitate. It was Edith Applewhite who received her the following afternoon, and it was Edith, more than the inspector, more than the roses, more than the flattened grass, who revealed to Miss Marple the essentials of what she needed to know, although Edith herself would have been astonished, for she said almost nothing at all during their conversation. She was a petite woman, around 30 years old, with the peculiar stillness of someone who had long lived in the shadows, making herself small in rooms that, by right and by heart, belonged to another. She poured the tea with a firm hand and answered each question with scrupulous and complete honesty. Yet Miss Marple found herself observing not Edith's words, but the small, unconscious gestures that characterized her, the way she sat, ankles crossed and hands clasped, as if she had long since grown accustomed to occupying only the bare essentials, the way her gaze fell, every few minutes, almost mechanically, on the closed door of what had clearly been her aunt's study. "This has been a very difficult year," said Edith, while Miss Marple remarked gently how trying it must be to lose an aunt, and, so soon after, to witness such violence on one's own doorstep. Aunt Constance's death was hard enough, And now this. Poor Mr. Pruitt. He was always so kind to me. He used to slip a mint into my letterbox at Christmas, if you can believe it, every year since I was a little girl. It's a very particular kind of kindness, said Miss Marple. The kind that remembers a person, and not just a house. Edith's eyes filled with tears for a moment, and she turned her gaze to the window. Yes, she said. He remembered people. I don't think Julian ever really— She broke off, quite visibly, her sentence closing like the daisies in Mrs. Hartnell's garden, and she picked up the teapot, although it didn't need to be filled. Miss Marple did not insist. In her long life, she had learned that the sentences one prevents oneself from finishing are often the truest ones one has begun, and that one can learn much more by letting such a silence settle in than by pursuing it. Instead, she asked, in the same gentle voice, whether the lawyer had come, in the months after Constance's death, about the settlement of the estate, and it was then that Edith said something that Miss Marple returned. That night, long after the lamp had been extinguished, like a small hard stone wedged between her thumb and forefinger. He came once, Edith said, just after Aunt Constance died. He said he had been pending further instructions from him Fellet. He thought it was a correction to the will, although nothing of the sort was ever found among his papers. He seemed very upset, but he never came back, and we assumed the matter had come to nothing. She said it in a light tone, as one repeats something minor and rather tedious, poured herself more tea, and the conversation continued, as it often does, on the party and the weather, and Miss Marple, sitting with her knitting needles casually on her knees, understood, with that particular quiet certainty which came to her only rarely, and only when something true had at last been revealed, that the whole plot had just been revealed to her, even if its name was not yet known to her. She left Larkspur Cottage at dusk, and retraced her steps along the garden wall. It was there, bending down with more effort than dignity, to pick up a glove which she had, in fact, intentionally dropped, that her fingers closed on something stuck in the yew hedge, less than 2 meters from where the broken rose was still turning brown in the gravel. It was a scrap of paper, torn in two along one edge, no bigger than a fingernail, stiff and thicker than ordinary writing paper. The sort of paper, she thought, turning it delicately in the fading light, that a law firm might use for its correspondence, and, along its tier, barely visible, the ghost of a printed letter, half of what had once been a capital letter, I-N. Miss Marple closed her hand around the object and remained motionless for a long moment. Chapter 3. The Charming Nephew. The village fete took place as planned, for it had been decided, in the tacit way such things were always decided in Ashcombe-under-Lyne, that cancelling it would be a greater affront to Walter Pruitt's memory than celebrating it quietly and with due respect. Accordingly, a quiet gaiety reigned on the vicarage lawn that Saturday afternoon. The garlands hung a little lower than usual. The brass band played its regular tunes at a slightly lower volume, and the vicar's wife had seen to it that a small offering box, elegantly typewritten and labelled, was always ready to receive donations. For the Mrs. Pruitt memorial stained glass window stood on the tea table next to the urn, although Walter, as far as anyone knew, had left no widow. Only, mused Miss Marple, a whole village of people determined to mourn him properly in the absence of anyone closer who had the right to do so. It was there, weaving between the stalls and the jam table, that Miss Marple first observed Julian Applewhite up close, and observed him, as was her custom, much more attentively than he could have possibly suspected. She recognized at once that he was an extremely pleasant man to look at and listen to. Tall, relaxed, with a natural good humor that put strangers at ease from the very first moment. He strolled among the stalls, always finding the right word, complimenting Mrs. Hartnell on the presentation of the cake, admiring with such obvious sincerity a little girl's watercolor of the church that the girl beamed for the rest of the afternoon, exchanging a private joke with the vicar that made the latter burst out laughing for the first time, Miss Marple suspected, since Thursday morning. He gave the impression, as he walked among them, of a man perfectly at ease, and it was precisely this impression, so complete and so naturally maintained, that captured Miss Marple's attention, in the same way that a performance, however excellent, always attracts the eye of someone who has spent their life noticing the effort made to appear natural. She watched him buy, with manifest grace, 3 raffle tickets from old Miss Aldous, who could no longer see well enough to give her change, and patiently recount them for her twice when she was confused, and she thought, as she watched him, that this was either a genuinely good man doing a small kindness for herself, or a man who had learned, very meticulously, what a genuinely good man looked like on the outside, and had carefully constructed himself in that image, as one builds a house from a picture in a magazine, without ever being quite sure that the rooms inside match the design. It was Mrs. Hartnell, leaning over the jam stall with the particular pleasure of a woman peddling gossip she has kept in reserve all week, who set in motion the event that would remain etched in Miss Marple's memory long after the party had ended. "He looks just like his father," she said, watching Julian laugh at something across the lawn. "Of course, we never knew him. He died so young, poor man, before Julian even left the nursery. But there's something about the shape of his shoulders, don't you think, that reminds me of the old apple-white portraits in the church." Constance always said that. It was said in a light tone, as is always said in villages, a banal comparison offered with slow jam, and it would have gone completely unnoticed if Miss Marple had not, at that precise moment, looked straight into Julian Applewhite's face. What she saw then lasted perhaps only as long as a deep breath, and would have completely escaped anyone who hadn't been accustomed, through long practice, to detecting such signs. It wasn't a twitch, strictly speaking, nothing so crude. It was rather a very slight stillness, a fleeting suspension of the fluid movement of his features, as if some mechanism behind that charming face had to, for the space of a heartbeat, stop and check its own operation before resuming. Then it was over, and he was laughing again at what the vicar had said, and the moment closed over as gently as water covers a fallen stone. But Miss Marple had seen it, and she put it away next to the torn piece of lawyer's paper, now carefully folded in her handkerchief, and the little unexplained pause in Edith's unfinished sentence, and thought, not for the first time in her life, but with a new and rather sad clarity, how much a person could quietly hide beneath an ordinary Saturday afternoon and a fine tweed jacket. She could have left this observation open, filed away without comment, if Mrs. Doyle had not found it some 20 minutes later near the coconut game, where the former housekeeper of Larkspur Cottage had settled down with a cup of tea, which she did not appear to be drinking, and an expression which suggested that she was waiting, with some patience, for precisely this opportunity. Mrs. Doyle was a robust, weathered woman with reddened hands, and displayed the particular bitterness of someone who had been dismissed from a position she had held with pride. She wasted no time in preamble. "You're the one staying with Mrs. Hartnell," she said. "You're the one asking questions." "I confess I ask a lot of them," said Miss Marple gently. "It's a fault of old age, I think. You become curious about things that are absolutely none of your business." "Well, you might wonder," said Mrs. Doyle, lowering her voice. "Although there was nobody within 10 meters, why nobody in this village dares say a word about this family, when everyone knows there's something fishy going on. Mrs. Applewhite dismissed me 2 weeks before she died, you know, after 11 years of service. She claimed it was a matter of saving money, but I assure you it wasn't. She was afraid of something, this last month, afraid enough to want fewer prying eyes around the house, and I was one eye too many." "Afraid of what, in your opinion?" Mrs. Doyle's mouth opened for a moment, as if she were weighing the pros and cons of what she knew, or thought she knew, could safely reveal in the open air on the parsonage lawn. "There are things Mrs. Applewhite never told that boy," she said finally, her voice dropping even further, "and things he never forgave her for, once he started to guess them himself. I heard them arguing once, through the office door. It was last spring, and I heard her tell him, as clearly as I think I can, that she had protected him from the truth about himself for over 30 years, and that it was up to her to settle that debt in her own way and in her own time, not for him to seek it out. And he answered her with something I've never forgotten, though I couldn't swear to every word." She stopped and glanced involuntarily across the lawn towards where Julian was standing, still laughing among the raffle tickets, his handsome head thrown back, seemingly totally unaware that anyone was talking about him. "He said," concluded Mrs. Doyle in a very low voice, "that a man had the right to know whose son he was, whatever the cost to her, and that if she refused to tell him to his face, he would find out for himself, in his own papers, even if it took him the rest of his life." The orchestra, a few yards away, struck up a new tune, lively and totally inappropriate for the moment, and Miss Marple stood motionless on the vicarage lawn, her cup of tea cooling in her hand, and thought of a piece of torn and folded lawyer's paper in her handkerchief, of a lawyer who had waited 8 months for instructions that never came, and of a young man's face so carefully regaining its relaxed expression after a brief moment of inattention, and she understood, with a small, cold certainty, in blatant contradiction with the sunlit lawn around her, that she had just been told, in the bitter, fragmentary memory of a housekeeper of an argument through a closed door, exactly what Julian Applewhite had spent most of the year trying to ignore. Chapter 4. The Weight of Small Suspicions. Inspector Faraday, as was discovered in the following days, had not been idle, whatever Miss Marple might secretly think of the way her investigation had turned out. He had drawn up, to his own satisfaction, a list of people likely to have some grievance against the Applewhite family, and he was pursuing them all with the earnest and unimaginative meticulousness of a young man convinced that guilt, like a stain, will always be visible to anyone who vigorously rubs the right spot. Reverend Sneed was the first to feel the weight of this attention and bore it, Miss Marple thought, with the wounded dignity of a man utterly untouched by any suspicion other than a long sermon. He received her, for she came to see him the following Tuesday, ostensibly for the Sunday service flowers. in his cluttered study, amidst piles of parish accounts which, from the anxious way his gaze constantly lingered on them, seemed to cause him a far deeper disturbance than the murder itself. "The inspector seems to believe," he said, with the particular bitterness of someone wrongly accused, "that because I was seen exchanging a few words with poor Pruitt 3 days before his death, I must hold a grudge against him. As if one couldn't get upset about a package of hymns being delivered incorrectly, without it meaning one is capable of murder." "And it was only the hymn books?" asked Miss Marple gently. "Only the hymn books," he said emotionally. "Though I confess I spoke to her more sharply than the situation warranted, something I have regretted ever since, and will regret even more, I dare say, for the rest of my life, given the way things have turned out. We are £300 short for the roof repairs, Miss Marple, and I had mistakenly convinced myself that a delay in delivering the Harvest Festival programs would be the final straw and bring down the whole enterprise." Pruitt took my remark very well, as it happened. He said, in essence, that a man who carries the burdens of others all day sometimes forgets that he has the right to unburden himself of his own for a moment. I have thought about this remark a great deal since Thursday. Miss Marple thought of this too, turning the document over as she walked back down the vicarage drive, and found there not the confession of a murderer, but the accidental epitaph of a genuinely gentle man, another small, unnoticed kindness added to the burden that Walter Pruitt seemed to have left behind wherever he went. And it struck her, once again, how strange it was that a man so obviously adept at bearing other people's burdens should, in the end, have been unable to rid himself of the burden that had finally cost him his life. Mrs. Doyle's case proved more complex, if only because her bitterness was entirely genuine, and, as Miss Marple knew from long experience, genuine bitterness has a way of making the innocent appear guilty in the eyes of anyone who doesn't bother to look more closely. It turned out that she had spent the entire morning in question at her sister's cottage in the neighbouring parish, mending clothes, a fact the inspector confirmed with obvious disappointment, for he had rather hoped, Miss Marple suspected, to conclude his investigation with the satisfaction of revenge after being dismissed. "She has good reason," he said, and then walked with Miss Marple along the path, like a young man who, almost against his will, is beginning to give more weight to his opinion than he would readily admit. A disgusted woman after 11 years, and in a lamentable way, if we are to believe her own account. But she was 5 kilometers away with a dozen witnesses, so the matter is closed. "There is usually a limit to that," observed Miss Marple, "among people who voice their grievances aloud quite freely and quite often. It is not, in my experience, the noisy grievances that should worry us, Inspector. It is those that no one has been permitted to voice at all." He looked at her out of the corner of his eye, as if he suspected that she meant something more specific than she was prepared to express openly. But Miss Marple merely smiled and remarked on the charm of hedges, leaving him to form his own opinion. It was that same evening, at the rather timid invitation of the inspector, for he had, at that moment, begun to seek her company in the modest lodging that Walter Pruitt had occupied since the death of his wife, a neat little cottage at the end of the road which the parish had not yet had the heart to rent to anyone else, that Miss Marple made the discovery which would not leave her until the whole affair was over. The cottage had that peculiar, frozen stillness of a place left exactly as its owner had left it, expecting to return. The kettle still sat on the stove. A half-completed crossword puzzle lay open on the arm of the armchair, and a framed photograph on the mantelpiece depicted a simple woman with a gentle face who could only be the late Mrs. Pruitt. Miss Marple wandered through the small rooms with the particular tenderness she reserved for the homes of the dead, touching nothing that was not necessary. It was in the bedroom, searching a chest of drawers at the somewhat clumsy request of the inspector, for he seemed to think, in some obscure way, that a woman's hands were more suited to such a search than her own, that her fingers closed on a small tin box, slipped under a folded shawl which had obviously belonged to Walter's wife, and which had been kept, all these years, exactly where her hands had last folded it. Inside the box, wrapped in a clean handkerchief, was a sum of money, not a fortune, but far more than a postman's modest salary could easily account for, which remained untouched and visibly unspent, as if it had been received not to be used, but to be put in safe-keeping, or out of shame. "Blackmail," declared Inspector Faraday immediately, with the radiant satisfaction of someone who senses a case finally solved. "That's your motive, Miss Marple. Pruitt knew something about someone and was paid to keep quiet, and whoever was paying him eventually grew tired of paying." Miss Marple kept the folded handkerchief on her knees for a long time, turning the notes over with careful, thoughtful fingers, and did not answer him immediately, for something about the sum and the way it was kept, hidden untouched, wrapped in his late wife's own handkerchief, as if he could not bring himself to spend it, or even look at it too often, contrasted sharply with the image of a blackmailer that the inspector was hastening to paint. A blackmailer, she thought, spends his money, or at least enjoys having it. This money had been carefully stored and hidden, like something one is ashamed of, rather than something one has earned. "It is certainly a considerable sum for a man of his standing to have earned honestly," she said finally, cautiously. "But I wonder, Inspector, if we haven't been too hasty in determining where that money went." He looked at her, clearly without understanding, and she did not explain herself further for the moment, for the thought had come to her only half-formed, a small, cold suspicion still seeking its final form, and she had long ago learned never to express such thoughts before they were ready to bear the weight of being spoken aloud. But she folded the handkerchief over her secret and put the box back exactly where she had found it, under the shawl that Walter Pruitt's late wife had folded with her own hands, and thought, with a sadness that surprised her by its depth, that whatever that money may have bought, it had, in the end, brought little comfort to Walter Pruitt, and that a man does not hide the money he is proud to have taken. Beneath the ordinary, kindly exterior of a postman who remembered everyone's birthday and slipped mints into the letterboxes at Christmas, there seemed to be a secret as carefully guarded as anything the Applewhites had buried at Larkspur Cottage. Miss Marple, walking home alone through the darkening alley, the cold weight of the little box still weighing on her thoughts, wondered, for the first time since arriving in Ashcombe-under-Lyne, if the kindest man in the village had kept a secret not to protect himself, but to protect someone else. Chapter 5. What the Ashes Knew. Condolence visits, as Miss Marple had long observed, possessed a peculiar social power, quite disproportionate to their apparent gentleness. They opened doors that no formal interrogation could ever open, allowed the person presenting them into rooms where an inspector would have needed no warrant to enter, and permitted them to ask questions that, under any other circumstances, would have been considered unforgivably impolite. It was with this conviction, and with a genuine and carefully chosen sympathy, that she returned to Larkspur Cottage the following afternoon, carrying a small pot of her own quince jelly, and making this perfectly apt remark. She had been thinking of Edith, and simply wished to spend some time in her company. Edith received her in the small parlour at the back, rather than the main drawing-room, which, as Miss Marple observed, was in itself a form of trust, the main drawing-room being reserved, in houses of this kind, for visitors whom one wished to impress, and the small drawing-room for those in whom one had begun, without really meaning to place one's trust. The fire had been lit to chase away the October chill, and it was there, settling herself in the armchair closest to the fireplace with the quiet comfort of an old lady happy with the warmth, that Miss Marple's gaze fell upon the hearth and lingered there a little longer than the conversation required. She thought the grate was exceptionally clean for a burning fire. The ashes had been carefully swept away, raked flat and evenly, without any of the small debris accumulated by daily burning. No fragments of old rolled-up newspapers, no blackened bits of kindling, no trace of the usual clutter that a fire, left to itself, generally retains from its history. Someone had cleaned this grate with far more care than the weekly habits of a modest household seemed to require, and, judging by the light grey film that remained on the surrounding panes, it had been done fairly recently. "Your home is very well maintained," she said, in the gentle tone of a woman making the most banal of observations. Edith glanced at the fire as if she were seeing it for the first time. "Mrs. Doyle's replacement is very conscientious," she said. "I confess I cleaned the grate myself yesterday. I'm not quite sure why. You feel like getting your hands dirty, I think, at times like these, and you can't keep inventing endless repairs." This was said easily, without apparent cunning, and Miss Marple, who absolutely believed in Edith's sincerity, even though she doubted the innocence of the impulse that underpinned it, thought that grief did indeed drive people to clean things that, on the surface, did not need cleaning, but that it led them, most often, to clean the rooms and objects closest to the thing they could not bear to look at directly. She waited until Edith had gone to fetch a second teapot. For the first, they noted with a gentle laugh, as women who are beginning to like each other often do, had become cold and undrinkable during their conversation, and during this brief, unsupervised interval, Miss Marple did something that she would have had difficulty justifying to a magistrate in later, more formal accounts of the case. Although her own conscience did not trouble her at all, she plunged her hand into the swept grate, where the poker lay beside it, and very gently stirred the fine grey ash beneath the top layer. After a moment of careful searching, she was rewarded with a single tenacious fragment that the fire had not entirely consumed, a stiffened loop of paper, blackened on all visible edges, which, by the special grace that chance sometimes grants to those patient enough to search for it, had folded back on itself as it burned and had preserved, inside this fold, a small intact corner, no bigger than a postage stamp. She pulled it out with the utmost care, using her handkerchief rather than her fingers, for it was as fragile as a dead leaf and threatened to crumble at the slightest movement of the hand, and held it near the glow of the fire to see what remained of the flames. On the unburned corner, faintly but perfectly legible, were the ends of several words printed in block capitals: R.D., Pembroke and Road. And below, in a hand she did not recognize, but which bore the particular and attentive inclination of a woman writing something she considered of the utmost importance, 3 words remained intact, isolated by the indifferent mercy of the fire of the sentence that had once surrounded them: my true wishes. Miss Marple sat for a long time, clutching the fragment in her handkerchief, listening to the small domestic noises of Edith bustling about in the kitchen behind the door, and felt the whole form of the mystery suddenly transform from a puzzle about who might have wanted to harm Walter Pruitt into something much darker and much sadder: the question of who so desperately needed the memory of a dead woman, true wishes never to be read by anyone. For it was there that the missing letter was found, or what remained of it, not stolen from Walter's bag by a passing vagabond, not lost in a banal postal mishap, but transported, at some point during those 8 long months, to this house, and burned, deliberately and completely, in this very fireplace, by someone who wanted it to disappear so badly that even its ashes had been swept away, raked and put away, as if putting away itself could erase from collective memory the fact of its existence. And Walter Pruitt, she thought, Walter Pruitt, who knew which envelopes were important, who had kept, hidden in his late wife's shawl, a sum of money he seemed more ashamed of than proud of. Walter Pruitt had known. He had known, perhaps, for 8 months, precisely what that fragment in his handkerchief represented, and he had said nothing, and he had continued to deliver the mail as usual, at the usual time, with the mints he slipped into his pocket for the children at Christmas, carrying within him a secret just as heavy as those the Applewhites themselves had buried. She heard Edith's footsteps returning in the corridor, and quickly closed her hand over the fragment, slipping the folded handkerchief into her sleeve with the practiced, unhurried discretion of a woman who has spent many years of her life appearing as harmless as is generally believed. "I'm so sorry," said Edith, setting down the jar of preserves. "You must find me terribly slow this afternoon. I feel like I haven't been able to concentrate on my thoughts lately." "Grief does that," said Miss Marple softly, and she meant it sincerely, even though another, colder part of her mind was already turning over and over the burnt fragment, weighing the shape of my true wishes. Faced with the 8-month silence of a lawyer and the shameful, hidden money of a postman, and arriving with the painful lucidity of a woman who has seen this particular pattern of human weakness repeated many times under many different roofs, at a conclusion that she was not yet ready to confide to anyone, not to Edith, sweet and naive in her presence, not to the zealous inspector, always on the lookout for his vagrants and his old grievances, and especially not to that charming and vigilant man on the other side of the village, whose face, for the time it took for a breath during a Saturday party, had shown her much more than he had ever wanted anyone to see. Someone in this house, she thought as she walked home through the growing darkness, the fragile fragment clutched to her heart, needed the true wishes of a dead woman to disappear so badly that he was willing, in the end, to let the gentlest man in the village disappear with him. Chapter 6. The Watch. The autumn rummage sale, held annually in the village hall to raise funds for the roof, which Reverend Sneed now mentioned in every sentence, usually held little interest for Miss Marple. a place to get rid of chipped crockery and coats that had become too small, and where, around trestle tables, people exchanged a host of information completely unrelated to the rummage sale. This year, however, it had taken on a whole new dimension, at Julian Applewhite's own suggestion, a small auction of miscellaneous objects and curiosities donated by several fine houses in the neighbourhood. His own antique shop providing, as he said with his usual charm, an expert eye to prevent the vicar from being duped by his parishioners. Miss Marple attended, as at most events, in the guise of a harmless old lady with nothing better to do with her afternoon, and took her seat 3 rows back, from where she could observe the unfolding of events, and particularly Julian himself, with the least possible risk of being observed in return. He conducted the small auction with real skill, eliciting bids from a naturally ungenerous crowd with a lightness that made even the purchase of a chipped fruit bowl a small victory for the buyer. And it was perhaps 20 minutes later, among a tray of miscellaneous objects too modest to have merited an individual description in the printed program, that he lifted a small silver pocket watch and held it up to catch the light from the high windows of the room. "That's a nice little piece," he said, turning it over so the crowd could admire the case. "Made of good quality solid silver, it's very accurate and, if I'm not mistaken, it's older than it looks. 10 shillings to start." Miss Marple, observing not the watch but the hand holding it, noticed something of which she was absolutely certain no one else in the hall bothered to notice: the very slight, very brief tightening of Julian's fingers around the chain, as if a part of him had wanted, at that precise moment, to close his hand completely around the object and remove it from sight, rather than sell it to a room full of strangers for 10 shillings. Finally, it ended up in the hands of Colonel Bantry's cook, who thought it pretty for her nephew, and Miss Marple, with the particular, unhurried patience of a woman who has learned that the best way to examine an object closely is simply to wait until its owner no longer possesses it, took care to find the cook again afterward among the teapots, and to admire the watch with such enthusiasm and precision that the good lady was delighted to hand it over to her, so that she could examine it more closely. It was, as Julian had said, a beautiful piece, the silver worn and shiny from being handled, and turning it over in her palm, Miss Marple discovered, engraved inside the case in small formal characters, 2 initials that she did not recognize at all: H. She thought about it with far more interest than about the watch itself. No Applewhite, living or recorded, bore those initials, at least according to her careful research conducted over 15 days. Neither Edward, nor Ernest, nor Henry, in the modest family tree that she had, now, almost entirely reconstructed thanks to the involuntary information of Mrs. Hartnell, the vicar, and the parish register, that she had consulted for an hour, apparently without any specific purpose, under the pretext of looking for the family of a former schoolmate. She returned the watch to the cook with the appropriate compliments, then went over to Julian, who was doing the accounts for the afternoon's takings with the vicar, and asked him, in the sweetest and most conversational tone, whether the little watch came from his own stock, or whether it was a family heirloom that he had been persuaded to part with for such a good cause. It was a small question, posed as casually as a remark about the weather, and she watched, with the careful, patient attention of a woman who has spent her whole life learning to read what lies behind an easy answer, how long it took Julian Applewhite to break into a smile. Finally, It happened only a fraction of a second after the allotted time, a delay so minute that a less attentive observer would have missed it completely, and even Miss Marple herself could not have testified to it in court. But that fleeting hesitation was there, before he said, in a light tone, "Oh, this old thing came with a lot of furniture during a house clearance near Medchester months ago. It's not mine, unfortunately, otherwise I wouldn't have sold it for so little. I have a weakness for silverware, whatever people say about me." It was a perfectly reasonable answer, given with perfect ease, and it would have satisfied anyone in the room, except for that old lady who, by chance, was observing his hand at the precise moment when he raised the watch to the light, and who had perceived, in that half-second of inattention, not the relaxed assurance of a merchant parting with his merchandise, but the small, intimate reluctance of a man parting with something he had never really wanted anyone else to see. That evening, instead of going directly back to Mrs. Hartnell's for supper, Miss Marple made her way to the small, dark reading room above the post office, where the parish kept its oldest records, birth, death and marriage registers, going back nearly a century, dusty account books that few living people had bothered to open for years, and asked the old clerk, with the harmless, contrite manner of a woman indulging in a hobby rather than a murderer, if she could look up the entries for the years immediately before and after Julian Applewhite's birth. The clerk, seeing nothing more sinister in the request than the idle curiosity of an old woman about a family she had heard about all week, left her to her business without a second thought, and Miss Marple sat alone in the fading light, the heavy ledger open before her, turning the fragile pages carefully, looking for nothing that she could name precisely, but the particular kind of small, ordinary anomaly that a lifetime spent reading such ledgers had taught her to recognize at first glance. She finally found it in an entry some 30 years old, a birth recorded not under the name Applewhite, but under a completely different name, a name she didn't recognize, belonging, according to the meagre notes in the register, to a young woman from the parish who had died, as noted separately in another handwriting, during the same year, and whose child, according to a brief formal note added a few months later in the margin, had been taken care of by relatives. Next to this word, written in ink browned by time, but still perfectly legible, were two initials which made Miss Marple put down the register with extreme care, and she sat motionless for a long time in the darkening reading room, while the church clock outside began to strike the hour in the nascent twilight. The initials were E.H. These same two letters, worn by time and stored in a small silver watch case, which Julian Applewhite had sold that very afternoon for 10 shillings to a stranger, rather than keep them in his possession for another day, and Miss Marple, closing the heavy ledger of hands which were not, she noted with some surprise, quite still, understood at last, with a certainty that engulfed her like the dawning darkness, who Julian Applewhite's son really was, and what it had cost him, all these months, to keep smiling at village fairs, as if he didn't know. Chapter 7. The Second Delivery. It took Miss Marple almost 2 days to find Tommy Aldous alone. In a village like Ashcombe-under-Lyne, an 11-year-old boy who witnesses a murder becomes something of a minor celebrity, followed by other boys eager to hear the story, and by anxious mothers, equally determined that he not be asked to tell it. She finally found him by chance, fishing without much hope of success in the little stream that ran alongside the vicarage. She then settled herself on a tree trunk not far from there, with the quiet patience of a woman who knows that children, like cats, usually come of their own accord if one is careful not to give the impression of wanting them. "You won't catch much there," she observed after a few minutes of friendly silence. "In my experience, the trout in that pond are far too old and cunning to be bothered by a boy's hook. But I imagine you know that better than I do." Tommy, who evidently expected to be questioned on the spot or completely ignored, and who had been somewhat unsettled by the fact that neither had occurred, admitted after a while that trout were indeed clever, and that he had had better luck further downstream, past the mill, and so, by the friendly little steps which such conversations always seem to require, the conversation at last came, without Miss Marple ever appearing to have steered it there, to the morning of Walter Pruitt's death. "I already told the policeman," said Tommy, with the particular weariness of a boy who has repeated a story so many times that it begins to sound like something that happened to someone else. "Old Pruitt came by the road as usual, around 9:30, and made his rounds of the cottages as usual, and I only noticed him again because I was still outside with my kite when he came back down towards Larkspur a second time, less than 20 minutes later." "And did he look exactly the same this second time as usual?" asked Miss Marple in a soft, measured tone, as if inquiring about the weather. "Postmen have such peculiar habits, I find. You can tell right away if anything about them is out of the ordinary." Tommy considered this with the grave seriousness that little boys bring to questions they had not previously deemed important enough to answer carefully. "He didn't have his bag like usual," he said slowly, thinking, "not across his body. He had something tucked into his coat, held close to him, his arm crossed, like you're carrying something you don't want to drop or for people to see. I noticed because it made him walk strangely, like his arm wasn't working properly." "And did he seem," asked Miss Marple in a very calm voice, "to be in a particular state of mind? Troubled, perhaps, or resolved to do something?" The boy frowned, searching for his words. An 11-year-old doesn't often get the chance. "He looked," he said finally, "like my father the day he had to go and tell Grandma that her old dog had been run over. Like he didn't want to do what he was going to do, but he was going to do it anyway." Miss Marple remained motionless on her fallen tree trunk, the stream continuing to flow indifferently beside them, and felt the whole configuration of this last morning fall into place with a clarity that brought her, unexpectedly, closer to tears than anything else in this whole sad story had done so far. This is not a bag carelessly tossed over the shoulder, like receiving an ordinary parcel. No, this is an object held tightly against the body, deliberately, for protection, like carrying an object that one has decided, at a certain price, to deliver at all costs, and which must under no circumstances be lost or dropped along the way. Walter Pruitt had not walked down that path a second time as a blackmailer returning to demand another payment, nor as a thief caught in a petty extortion gone wrong. He had walked down it. She understood now with a certainty that enveloped her like twilight, as a man finally performing, after an inner struggle she could only guess at, an act of conscience, bringing back to Larkspur Cottage something he had, for reasons of his own, hidden for nearly 8 long months, and which he had decided, that morning, he could no longer hide. She walked through the village in the fading afternoon light, constantly reflecting on this new understanding, and found, quite unintentionally, that her path had led her back to the small law firm on the main street, the same firm she now knew thanks to Edith's casual remark a few weeks earlier, who had once waited, in vain, for instructions that never came. On a whim that she didn't really consider, she went in and found old Mr. Pembroke himself behind the counter, a dry and precise man, well past retirement age, who, she suspected, had stayed at his post mainly because he could no longer imagine what a day might contain without him. She asked him, in that harmless, contrite manner she had perfected over the years of asking exactly the questions she needed to know most, whether he remembered the correspondence he had once expected from the late Mrs. Applewhite, and whether he had ever known what had become of it. Mr. Pembroke's dry face lit up for a moment. "A strange case indeed," he said. "She came to see me in person less than a fortnight before her death. A most intimate, most personal conversation, Miss Marple, the details of which I cannot yet reveal, though the lady in question now cares very little who knows her private life. I drew up certain instructions according to her directions, and sent them by post for her to sign and keep safe, expecting to receive them, duly certified, within the week. They never arrived. I wrote twice more, growing ever more anxious, for the matter was delicate and, dare I say, urgent, and, having received no reply, and Mrs. Applewhite having died so suddenly and unexpectedly soon after, I confess that the whole affair slipped from my grasp, caught up in the whirlwind of routine business related to settling her estate, according to the will which I already possessed. I've thought about it since then. I'm not afraid to tell you. I've thought about it a lot. And you never learned?" Miss Marple asked very carefully, "what those instructions contained?" "Only," said Mr. Pembroke, lowering his voice with the peculiar discretion of a man who has kept other people's secrets for so long that it has become second nature to him, "she wanted me to know, from her own hand, that a wrong committed 30 years earlier could not be left unresolved simply because it was easier to leave it unresolved, and that whatever the cost, in the little time she thought she had left, she fully intended to see it finally righted." He added nothing, for, in truth, there was nothing more he knew how to say. But Miss Marple, returning to the street which was cooling in the twilight, the little bell above the lawyer's door still ringing faintly behind her, felt the last piece of the puzzle which she had been trying to put together for the past 2 weeks finally solidify into a picture whose contours she could no longer be mistaken about, even if a softer part of herself still wished it so at that moment. The wish of a dying woman, 30 years later, to see an injustice righted. A letter that never arrived. A postman who had hidden it, out of pity, for 8 long months, and who, one October morning, had finally decided that the injustice could no longer be tolerated, and had carried this decision, clutched to his chest like a treasure too precious and too dangerous to let fall, to the end of the garden path at Larkspur Cottage, where someone had been waiting all this time, with every reason in the world to make sure that he never delivered it. Chapter 8. The Weight of a Name. The next morning she chose to return to Larkspur Cottage, for she had learned, in the course of a very long life spent observing how difficult truths were best communicated, that such things needed daylight rather than growing darkness. Daylight, and the ordinary little comforts of a breakfast table not yet cleared, and a kettle still hot enough to be usefully employed in the moments after someone has been given something almost too heavy to hold. Edith received her, as before, in the small sitting room at the back, and it was there, over tea that neither of them really wanted to drink, that Miss Marple laid out, as delicately as she could, all the items she had gathered. The torn piece of fabric taken from the hedge, the swept-away gate, and its stubbornly intact fragment bearing 3 words in the handwriting of a dying woman, the account of the lawyer's instructions that were never given, and finally, although she chose her words with the greatest care, the old parish register and the 2 initials it had given her. She observed Edith's face throughout the interview with the sustained and painful attention of a woman who has already had to announce such news, and who knows that there is no way to soften it without, in the end, simply prolonging the wait before it is fully understood. Edith did not cry, which surprised Miss Marple far more than tears would have. She remained motionless, her hands clasped in her lap, in that same attentive and measured stillness that Miss Marple had noticed in her from their very first meeting. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and questioning, like that of a woman discovering for the first time a house where she had lived all her life, and which now contained a room whose existence she had been unaware of. "I never knew anything about it," she said. "You must believe me, Miss Marple, whatever else you may have believed about that family. I never knew that Aunt Constance intended to change anything, much less why. I only knew that there had been a quarrel between her and Julian in the spring, and that afterward she seemed to shrink, quieter, more inclined to be alone with her correspondence, and not say anything to anyone. I thought it was simply her illness beginning to take its toll. I never imagined—" She stopped, briefly brought the back of one hand to her mouth, and when she withdrew it, her composure had returned, but something behind her eyes had not, and would not, Miss Marple suspected, for a very long time. "So, he's not really my cousin," said Edith. "It doesn't matter what we called each other all these years." "He is as much your cousin," said Miss Marple, with a gentleness that emanated from deep old age and weariness, "as love, a shared childhood, and 30 years of familial kindness can unite 2 people. Blood ties are only a tiny part of what binds a family together, my dear, whatever lawyers may say. But I fear he was never convinced of this himself, and that he spent, I think, a good part of his life fearing that, the day someone else believed it too, he would lose the only home he had ever known." Edith remained silent for a long time, turning the document over, and when she spoke again, it was in a small, cautious voice, like that of someone who approaches very slowly, a thought whose end she did not want to see. "You think he knew," she said. Before Mr. Pruitt's death." "You think he had already discovered it?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that a man does not part with a watch that has been treasured in his family for 30 years on the very day he learns that its story is no longer part of a narrative he can bring himself to tell, unless some very recent event makes that past unbearable. And I think that a postman does not carry a lawyer's letter against his chest like a sore on the one morning in 11 years when he deviates from his unchanging routine, unless he has finally decided that a promise made to someone, out of pity, guilt, or perhaps both, can no longer be honestly kept for one more day." She let the situation settle in the silence of the room, then said, very cautiously, observing Edith's face, "I believe Mr. Pruitt didn't keep this letter from you all these months for personal gain. I believe he kept it because someone asked him to, someone he liked, someone he pitied, and whom he persuaded, in a very human moment of weakness, to dispose of an old lady's last wishes, and I believe that on the morning of her death he decided he could no longer condone this disappearance, whatever the cost, to the person who had asked him to do it. Edith's hand, when it reached for her teacup this time, was not quite steady, and Miss Marple, seeing it tremble slightly against the china, understood that she had just witnessed how all the understanding a woman had of her own family was being reorganized around a single, unbearable possibility that she had not yet allowed herself to voice aloud. "You think it was Julian?" Edith finally said in a low voice. "You think Julian paid him to burn Aunt Constance's real wishes, and that when Mr. Pruitt finally tried to bring them here—" She did not finish her sentence. She did not need to. The fire in the small fireplace, which she had cleaned again, Miss Marple noted, whether out of habit or a deeper need to erase what, in truth, could not be erased, crackled once, softly, in the silence between them, and Edith looked at it as if it had spoken. "I can't believe it," she said, though something in her voice suggested that, in fact, she had already begun to believe it. "Anyway, Miss Marple, I've known him all my life. He was good to me when I was a simple, frightened, orphaned girl, and never, not once in 30 years, did he make me feel inferior to the relative in this house, whatever the will may say." "I can't believe he's capable of—" "I don't believe," said Miss Marple in a very gentle voice, "that he thought himself capable of such a thing either until the fateful moment arrived. That is often how the worst things happen, my dear, not through premeditated malice, but because an ordinary man, frightened, discovers too late what he is prepared to do rather than lose the one thing he has spent his life fearing to lose." She then stood up, gathering her things with the deliberate slowness of a woman who knows that what remains to be done cannot, out of respect for anyone, be postponed any longer, and told Edith, gently but without leaving room for discussion, that she must not speak to anyone about what had happened between them that morning. Not yet. Not before she had had the opportunity to see another matter settled for herself. "Where are you going?" asked Edith, an old protective instinct making itself heard in her voice despite everything Miss Marple had just told her. "At the shop," said Miss Marple, and she noticed as she said this that her voice was not as steady as she would have liked. "It is near, I think, the time when someone should ask Julian Applewhite frankly what he has been so afraid to reveal all this long year." She stepped out into the cool grey of early evening, the alley already darkening beneath the elms, and walked, with a slow and deliberate step, like a woman who has solved many mysteries in her long life, without taking any particular pleasure in doing so, towards the small lit window of the antique shop at the end of the main street, where a lamp had just been lit to fight against the nascent darkness, and where, behind the glass, a familiar figure moved alone among her silent and attentive curiosities, totally unaware that the last ordinary evening of her life had already begun, without her knowledge. Chapter 9. What the Lamp Revealed. The bell above the shop door gave its usual little tinkling sound as Miss Marple entered, and for a moment the familiar disorder of the place, the large clocks that ticked at different times, the dim glow of the old silverware, the smell of beeswax and dust that seemed to belong to every antique shop she had ever been in, enveloped her comfortably, as if the room itself did not yet know what evening would become. Julian looked up from the small table where he was sorting a tray of buttons and seals with the quiet absorption of a man happy to occupy his hands with some small mechanical task, and his face took on, as always, a welcoming expression. "Miss Marple, what an unexpected pleasure, so late in the day." "I was just about to close. May I show you something, or is this just a friendly visit?" "A bit of both, I think," said Miss Marple, settling herself, uninvited, into the only comfortable armchair in the shop. An old wingback chair, she guessed, reserved for customers who liked to linger before making their purchases. "I must confess, however, that this friendliness is unlikely to last until the end of the conversation, and I am truly sorry about that, because in such a short time I have grown to like you very much, Mr. Applewhite. Whatever happens between now and the end of the evening." Something crossed his face at that moment, quickly, and disappeared almost before she even noticed it. The same fleeting stillness she had first glimpsed at the parsonage party. But his voice, when he answered, remained perfectly light. "This seems very worrying for a Tuesday evening. Could I have sold someone a fake Sheffield license plate?" "I think you know," said Miss Marple in a soft voice, but without any hesitation, "that it's much more serious than that." She then told him, slowly, without accusation in her voice, with the same patience and calm she might have used to explain a difficult sewing project to a student, everything she had gathered: the torn corner of the hedge, the swept-away gate and its recalcitrant fragment, the 8 months of unanswered letters from the lawyer, the watch with his 2 engraved initials, and the entry in the old parish register that had finally revealed to her whose real father he was. She watched him all the way with the same sustained and sad attention she had given Edith that morning, and saw, as she spoke, the natural charm slowly evaporate from his face, not all at once, but gradually, like the colors that fade from the sky at dusk, until there was nothing left but something much older and much more tired than the handsome, carefree man who, a few days before, had auctioned off a silver watch with such lightness. He remained silent for a long time. He placed the tray of buttons with excessive care, as if he feared that a sudden movement might break something in the room, besides the porcelain. And when he finally spoke, his voice had lost all trace of the warmth that the village had given him so much. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Everything, I mean, not just suspicions." "I've suspected its form for a few days," said Miss Marple. "I only know it fully this afternoon." He laughed then, a short, terrible laugh, totally devoid of humor, and turned away from her to the window, where the last grey rays were rapidly fading over the roofs of the main street, and stood for a moment with his back to her, his shoulders tensed in a way that suddenly and painfully reminded him of the old church portraits to which Mrs. Hartnell had compared him at the party, though for reasons entirely different from any they could have imagined that day. "She told me herself, you know," he said so quietly that Miss Marple had to lean forward to hear him. "Aunt Constance. In the spring, in her study, less than 3 months before she died. I had begun to suspect something for years. Little details, arguments overheard as a child, a resemblance no one ever wanted to explain, but to suspect something and to have it said, plainly, to your face, by the only mother you've ever known, those are 2 very different kinds of grief, Miss Marple, and I don't think either of us should pretend otherwise." "What did she tell you?" asked Miss Marple, although she thought she already knew most of it. "That I wasn't her sister's son at all," he said, still facing the window, "but the child of a girl from the village who had died in childbirth. whom the family had discreetly and kindly taken in, out of guilt, I think, even though they never really said what for, and raised as their own child, without ever telling me, because they believed, in their old-fashioned way, that a lie kept out of love was sweeter than a truth that could only hurt. They intended to rectify their mistake before they died. They wanted to leave everything to Edith, clearly, with the reasons explained, so that no one could ever again claim that this fiction was anything but a fiction. They thought they were acting with courage and honesty at the very end of their lives by righting an injustice that had gone on for far too long. "And you couldn't let her do that," said Miss Marple, very quietly. He then turned to face her, and there remained nothing in his expression of the charming man who had counted out change twice for old Miss Aldous at the party, only a terrible, naked weariness, the look of a man who has carried something very heavy for a very long time and who has finally been allowed to put it down, whatever the cost. "I begged her not to send it," he said. "I told her I didn't need the money. God knows that was almost true, but I couldn't bear the thought of the whole village suddenly knowing I'd never really belonged there, that all the kindness I'd received, all my life, had been reserved for a lie bearing my face. She wouldn't listen. She said it was up to her to settle the debt, in her own way, and she mailed the letter herself before I could stop her. She died 3 weeks later without ever knowing if it reached the Pembroke office." "But it never reached Pembroke's office," said Miss Marple, "because Walter Pruitt understood what it was about, and knowing, I believe, exactly how it would affect you if you received it, he couldn't bring himself to hand it over either. He came to see me," said Julian, and his voice, for the first time, began to tremble seriously. 15 days after his death. He had kept it all this time, he explained, wanting to determine what was right, but he couldn't make up his mind and thought, God help him, that it was up to me to decide whether this document should be handed over, since my life depended on it. I begged him to burn it. I paid him, yes, not to keep silent about a crime, Miss Marple, whatever your inspector may believe, but to hand it over to me, unopened, so that I could destroy it myself and never have to know, for certain, the nature of this thing I had always more or less suspected. He agreed. He felt pity for me, I think, more than anything, pity enough to break with a lifelong habit and do something he knew, even as he did it, was beyond his control. He stopped and pressed a hand firmly against the window frame, as if the store itself had suddenly begun to tilt beneath him. "And then, 3 days ago," said Miss Marple in a very gentle voice, in the silence that followed, his conscience overcame his pity, and he finally decided that Constance Applewhite's last wish deserved to be honoured, whatever the cost to you both, and he came back a second time, along the garden path, carrying it to his chest like something he could not bring himself to let go of, to finally give you what he had promised to destroy. Julian did not answer her directly. He turned slowly to face her across the darkening shop, his handsome face completely transformed by grief and terror into something she barely recognized from the party, and said in a voice that had become very weak and very childlike, like that of a frightened boy finally confessing something he knew, even as he said it, that he could never erase. "I only wanted to stop him from coming in. I only wanted to take the letter back from him and finally finish what I'd already paid him for. I didn't mean, Miss Marple, I swear to God, I didn't mean." He could not finish his sentence. He didn't need to. Outside, In the nascent darkness of the main street, the church clock began, with terrible banality, to strike the hour, and Miss Marple, motionless in her old wing-back chair, understood, with a sadness that drew from the depths of her long experience of human weakness, that she had finally heard the whole story, and that all she had to do was follow it to the end. Chapter 10. The Postman Who Never Ringed Twice. For a long moment they remained motionless, and the shop held its breath around them. The large clocks continued to tick in their divergent rhythms. The last grey glimmer escaped from the window. The ordinary little noises of the street faded behind the glass, utterly indifferent to what had just been said. Julian Applewhite stood there, one hand still resting against the window frame, his head bowed, and Miss Marple understood that the silence following a confession was often more dangerous than the confession itself, for it is in these silences that a frightened man, having confessed the worst, sometimes finds the courage to flee, or the despair to do something far worse than flee. She didn't move from her armchair. A lifetime spent accompanying people as their carefully constructed personalities crumbled had taught her that silence was often the kindest and safest thing to offer. So, sitting quietly, her hands clasped in her lap, she let him find, at his own pace, the path that would allow him to finish what he had to say. "Tell me," she said finally in a gentle voice, "what happened in the garden? Not what you've already told me, but everything, from the beginning of this morning until its end. I believe you've carried this burden alone for 3 days, Mr. Applewhite, and I don't believe a man has ever found relief in silence, even if he persuaded himself that it protected him." He turned away from the window then, and in the last rays of the setting sun, his face had lost all trace of the ease that had made him, for so many years, the most beloved man in Ashcombe-under-Lyne. All that remained was something more raw and, in its own way, more human than anything the village had ever been allowed to see. He came to the cottage that morning as usual, Julian said, in a low, measured voice, with the terrible imperturbability of a man who had given up pretending. "I was in the garden. I'd gotten into the habit of going there almost every morning since Aunt Constance died, though I couldn't have told you why, except that it was the only place in the house where I could still feel his presence without the full weight of the office pressing down on me. He gave me the usual mail first, at the usual time, then he left, and I thought, God forgive me, I thought the matter was finally settled, that the conscience that had tormented him for those 8 months had finally found peace thanks to the money I had given him." He paused, swallowed, and Miss Marple saw his hand tighten once more against the window frame, as if the memory itself required physical support. Then he came back. Less than 20 minutes later, I saw him walking back up the aisle, the letter pressed against his coat, and I knew, as soon as I saw how he was holding it, what he intended to do. I went to see him. I asked him. I think I was calm at first, although I'm not sure anymore, what he planned to do, given that we had an agreement, given that I had paid him in good faith to destroy the letter. And he told me. His voice finally broke, and for a moment he could not continue, and Miss Marple waited, without impatience, for him to recover. He apologized. He said he'd thought about it every day since Aunt Constance's death, and had come to believe that a dying woman's last sincere wish could not, in good conscience, be stifled by a living man's fear, however great it might be in his eyes. He said, and I've heard it again and again, that he'd spent his life bearing other people's truths, whether welcome or not, and that he didn't think he had the right, in the end, to decide which truths deserved to be heard and which didn't. He handed me the letter. I think he wanted me to read it myself, there in the garden, rather than have it sent to Pembroke without my knowledge. It was a kind gesture, Miss Marple. Even then, even breaking his word, it was a kind gesture. And you couldn't accept it as such, said Miss Marple, very gently. I reached out to take it, Julian said, intending to snatch it from him and destroy it right there in front of him, if necessary, to make him understand that it was too late for kindness, that silence was the only pity left. He wouldn't let go. He was holding it from me gently, I think. I don't believe he meant to fight, just keep it safe until I calmed down. And I still don't know exactly how it happened, except that I pushed him harder than I meant to, and he tripped against the low wall by the rose bushes. There was a stone there, an old broken piece of the wall, and he fell on it and didn't get up. A deathly silence had settled around them in the store. Even the ticking of the clocks seemed, for a moment, to have slowed down. I didn't mean to kill him, Julian said, his voice almost trailing off. I want you to believe it, whatever you think of me. Since then, I keep wondering if it's true, or just a lie a desperate man tells himself to make the unbearable bearable, and I no longer know the answer. I only know that I knelt beside him in that garden, and that I understood, in the space of about 30 seconds, that the kindest man in this village had died because of a fear I had never had the courage to honestly face in 30 years of living with it, and that I took the letter from his hand, burned it that very evening, and told myself, God forgive me, that I was only protecting the truth so that it wouldn't do more harm than it already had. He fell silent. Outside, the church clock finished chiming, and the usual evening noises in the main street resumed their course, without anyone suspecting that the entire perception the village had of itself had just quietly collapsed in a small shop filled with old clocks and even older silverware. Inspector Faraday arrived within half an hour, summoned by the note Miss Marple had asked the shop boy to deliver as soon as Julian began to speak seriously. She had, in fact, rightly judged that a confession made freely to an old lady in an armchair would carry more weight and be less damaging to the dignity of the person making it than a confession extracted under the duress of an official interrogation. Julian offered no resistance when the moment came. He even seemed slightly relieved to finally know what was going to happen, as if ignorance had been the heaviest burden from the start. You knew, the inspector said to Miss Marple later, as they stood together in the darkened main street, while the sound of the car carrying Julian faded into the distance. Almost from the beginning, didn't you? While I was chasing after tramps and disgruntled governesses, I knew, said Miss Marple, that a punctual man doesn't deviate from his habits without an excellent reason, Inspector, and that the best reasons, those that cost the most to implement, are rarely those that allow for the writing of a flawless police report. I'm afraid the truth is usually much less convenient than a vagrant. He gazed at her for a long time in the lamplight, this serious young man who had so wished the world were simpler, and said, with almost genuine humility, I don't think I'll ever learn to see things as you do, Miss Marple. I don't think so, she said without malice, because you're still young enough to want people to be good or bad, Inspector. And the sad truth is that most of us are a little of both, inextricably linked, and it's only very rarely, under very particular pressures, that we discover which half of ourselves will react first when it really matters. I hope, for your own sake, that you're never asked that question as plainly as Mr. Applewhite. She visited Edith one last time before leaving Ashcombe-under-Lyne, on a grey and still morning when the last leaves of the season were falling slowly and heavily in front of the parlour window, and found her, as she had somewhat expected, sitting motionless with her hands clasped in her knees, in the peculiar stillness of a woman who has had to absorb a great many things in a very short time, and who has not yet finished absorbing them. "I wrote to him," Edith said without preamble, "at the county jail. I don't know yet if he'll reply, or even if he'll have the courage, but I couldn't bring myself to let him disappear from my life as if he'd never been a part of it, whatever the register says. He was my cousin every important day of my childhood, Miss Marple, and I'm not prepared to let a 30-year-old piece of paper destroy that, whatever it may have done before. This is probably the wisest and most benevolent thing that will be said in this whole sad affair, my dear, and I hope you will stick to it, whatever the village may whisper about it in the coming weeks. Villagers are quick to decide who deserves to be forgiven and who does not. My experience has shown me that those who continue to forgive quietly, without waiting for permission, are generally those who best understand the true meaning of forgiveness. She took her leave soon after, and walked down the path alongside Larkspur Cottage one last time. The walled garden, guided by a tacit village instinct, was already being tended again. The broken rosebush was being pruned, the trampled grass reseeded, and the whole daily routine was resuming its peaceful course in this place, which, for one October morning, had borne the full weight of a family's buried grief. As she passed, she thought of Walter Pruitt, who had faithfully carried other people's letters for 11 years, and who, at the very end, had been asked to carry something far heavier than a simple letter. The choice between comfortable silence and a harsh truth. He had chosen, at the risk of his life, to gently lay the truth at the right door, rather than let it be stifled for someone else's comfort. As she reflected one last time on the whole affair, in the stagecoach taking her back to St. Mary Mead, it seemed to her that the tragedy of Ashcombe-under-Lyne had never truly been a tragedy of greed, whatever the will and the inheritance might have suggested. It was, at its core, the tragedy of a far older and more common human weakness, the comforting yet destructive belief that a kindness intended to spare suffering could indefinitely replace the harder, more honest effort of simply telling the truth. Constance Applewhite had lied out of love for 30 years, to spare a frightened boy a hurt she could not bring herself to inflict, and had died trying, too late, to undo it. Walter Pruitt had uttered a milder, less serious version of the same lie for 8 months, out of pity for a man for whom he couldn't help but feel compassion, and had finally died trying to repair his own. And Julian Applewhite, poor, frightened, charming Julian, had spent his entire life constructing an identity from the silences carefully orchestrated by others, and had discovered, in a terrible half-minute by a garden wall, that a life built on being spared the truth is a house without foundations, ready to collapse at the slightest weight of the one trying to stand on it. As she watched the hedgerows pass by the bus window in the pale autumn light, she thought there was no particular satisfaction in having solved the riddle, only the silent, painful feeling of having realized, once again, how costly ordinary human weakness could be when allowed to hide, long enough, behind the mask of love. Justice, she reflected, was rarely as pure as villagers liked to imagine, sitting around their teacups deciding who was wicked and who was merely unlucky. It asked, more often than not, simply that the truth reach its destination, however painful it might be. And it was Walter Pruitt, the gentlest, most unassuming man in Ashcombe-under-Lyne, who had understood this better than anyone, and who had ultimately paid the highest price a postman could pay for insisting that a letter reach its recipients. The stagecoach continued on its way to St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple, her hands clasped over her half-finished knitting, finally allowed herself a small and very private sadness for this man who had never desired anything but to belong to a place unconditionally, and thought that perhaps the greatest mercy left to anyone was simply this, that the letter, after all that had happened, had finally been delivered.